Inside New Orleans Sports with Eric Asher is underwritten by...
At Villere's Florist, we deliver the magic of flowers 7 days a week to the North Shore and South Shore in the New Orleans area. Whether it's for birthday parties, baby celebrations, Villere's provides colorful floral displays for all. With a store full of fresh-cut flowers, exotic tropical flowers, orchids, roses, and even fruit baskets, our goal is to make your vision a reality. Villere's Florist, proudly serving Louisiana since 1969. Mr. Ed's Oyster Bar and Fish House has been shucking here since 1979. Located at 3117 21st Street in Metairie, Mr. Ed's Oyster Bar and Fish House offers raw, fried, and grilled oysters, as well as a range of Cajun and Creole dishes. Enjoy a dozen with a smile.
Good evening, New Orleans, and welcome to Inside New Orleans Sports. I'm your host, Eric Asher. Over the next hour, we're going to talk a lot about the home teams, of course, the New Orleans Saints, New Orleans Pelicans, LSU, and Tulane. And tonight, joining us on the program are Les East and David Grubb of CrescentCitySports.com. Guys, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being with us as always. And before we get started, guys, we got the mic on inside of the studio. If we could take care of that so we're not getting any feedback here. Les, if you would, why don't you let the folks know a little bit about Crescent City Sports and everything that you're involved with outside of that?
Well, great. Thanks for having me back, Eric. CrescentCitySports.com, of course, is devoted to local coverage, Saints, Pelicans, LSU, and Tulane that you mentioned. And, of course, preps are a big part of what we do as well. And I'm also working on a variety of other projects covering LSU for SaturdayDownSouth.com, which is a pretty popular website for SEC football. And I've recently started writing for the paper in New Iberia, the Daily Iberian. So I'll be covering Saints training camp on a regular basis for them, among other things. So staying busy.
Mm-hmm. And David? Again, thank you for driving all the way from Baton Rouge to come and join us here on the program. CrescentCitySports.com. You kind of double dip for CrescentCitySports.com.
Right. Primarily, I cover the Pelicans, but also LSU football in the fall, and a little baseball and basketball when we get in the mix. High school, of course, high school football for Kentran every Friday night, and then every Thursday I do features with KYOK Radio in Houston and talk sports and big picture there.
Very good, guys. Let's get started. We'll start with the Pelicans tonight. Free agency starting on July 1st. The ability for teams to be able to reach out to free agents and at least discuss the parameters of a contract. And then, of course, shortly after that, they'll be able to sign their with them. I think it's July 6th is when the moratorium is up there. Guys, from what I understand, about $77 million in contracts guaranteed right now against the cap with Rondo and Cousins unsigned. This is going. I talked about it a little bit today on the radio show. Man, this is a one of the, when you start looking at what's going to happen in this offseason, one of the most critical offseasons in the history of the franchise, because there's so much that's on the line, especially with Anthony Davis being able to opt out in 2 years, even with that 35% percentage of the cap, maybe $40 million supermax contract they could waive in front of him. Not a lot of money to play with, and then you're coming off trying to figure out, how much more can you get out of an aging Rajon Rondo, and what type of player will Boogie Cousins be if you can woo him back, and will you have to be in a situation where you're going to get in a bidding war with other teams, or would it be a situation where ultimately the Pelicans will have the leverage because teams maybe are not willing to take a chance on a guy that has ruptured his Achilles tendon? Les, I'll take you first. To me, this is, there seem to be tailing contracts around Anthony Davis's, which left on his deal here, like 2 to 3 years. They're kind of all in on this particular year with not a lot of money to play with.
No, they don't have a lot of money to play with, and I think it's going to be an extremely complicated next several days for Dell Demps. Everything starts with DeMarcus Cousins. How that shakes out will have an effect on what happens with Rajon Rondo. It'll certainly have an effect on who they want to and are able to bring in from the outside. They're not going to be able to spend a lot of money regardless bringing in people from the outside. But, they have 3 different options with Cousins: do a sign and trade, bring him back, or let him go in free agency. I think it's certain that the least desirable of those is to let him go and not get compensation. So they're going to explore a sign and trade. Everybody else is as uncertain about his health as the Pelicans are, so it's difficult to tell what kind of compensation you'd be able to get. I do think the Pelicans have more leverage in contract talks than they had prior to the injury, because they hold more cards, not knowing exactly how he's going to recover. Apparently he's doing everything possible to get back. I'm sure he is, but that's a bad injury, Achilles, especially on a guy carrying 300 pounds on his feet. So a lot of uncertainty there. If they can't sign and trade him, I've said all along, I think I said it on this show, that I think it's more likely he leaves in one fashion or another than comes back. But I think Alvin Gentry is right when he says you don't just get rid of a guy with 26 points and 12 rebounds a game and get better. Yeah. You don't do that cavalierly. So you have to decide what's best. It would be difficult for them to play one way with Niko Mirotic and another way with Cousins.
Yes.
But they can do that. It's a problem a lot of teams would like to have, fitting those pieces together. And it's an even bigger challenge, I think, to defend it than it is to utilize it. So I don't rule that out completely, but I still think it's more likely that he leaves. And I think ideally they want to be able to do a sign and trade. I just don't know if they're going to be able to get great compensation.
Dave, I'm going to ask you the question about how critical this offseason is. But can we explore sign and trade for a minute? Because the last thing you want to do in a sign and trade is give the other team the leverage and have to take back trash. You don't want to take back aging veterans. You're not in a position with, again, just a few years left on Anthony Davis' contract to be able to take back veterans that are expiring contracts, because even if the contracts expire next year, then you've only got really a season and a half to convince Davis that you want to win a championship here in New Orleans. So, and normally you'd say, you know what, take the sign and trade, take the bad contracts back, live with it for a year, and then we'll clear our books, and then we'll be able to go out and get other free agents. But I don't know if the Pelicans are in that position this year. And again, I don't know if other teams are in a position where they want to give away quality players to bring in a Boogie Cousins that is still a question mark.
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on how the market settles, and that'll be the guys like Paul George and LeBron James and where they decide to go. The Lakers are often mentioned as a possible destination. I don't think they're really in the market for DeMarcus Cousins because of that injury and because of their short time frame. But I think, let's say LeBron James decides to stay in Cleveland. I think the likelihood of a Boogie trade to Cleveland to send back maybe a Rodney Hood, who the Cavaliers have extended their qualifying offer to, and a Kevin Love or a Tristan Thompson to get that contract off of their books. And we know that LeBron, has a great admiration for DeMarcus, picked him for his all-star squad, has said that he's the best big man in the league before. So there's that likelihood. You look at a Washington team after they've moved their only center in Marcin Gortat, out west. Their need becomes greater. So they're also a team that's a playoff team. You have John Wall there, who played with Cousins at Kentucky, so a familiarity that may exist. Dallas becomes your third potential partner if they strike out on Clint Capella or DeAndre Jordan. And even you look at the Clippers as a potential partner if they keep Jordan and say, we'd like to swap that deal out, or maybe give you one of our, they have Lou Williams still under contract. They have some guards, a Danilo Gallinari, who folks have loved in this area for some time as an interesting, player at the small forward position. So it's a limited market, but there are teams that do have that specific need, and that's what the Pelicans are going to have to find for that. But what they're primarily going to have to find is a team that has a contract as big as DeMarcus is going to be, and somebody who's willing to give up a wing.
Yeah. Now, why don't you talk about how critical this offseason is?
Yeah, essentially, because of the Cousins injury, everything is shortened. Because even if he does come back, you are missing the majority of this season, either with him coming, back from rehab, or playing off the bench, and having a limited role as he gets himself back into full basketball shape. So you still, at the end of this season, won't know exactly what you have with this group. With that, the entire backside of your organization is switching around. Like you said, there is no long-term solution at the point guard position with Rajon Rondo. Even if you sign him, at most, he's back for 2 years. So everything building towards that Anthony Davis, the Pelicans have a dearth of young players that they've developed to come up and fill positions if they let veterans go. And the problem is their veterans are very expensive. So moving in a forward direction, jumping up from 6 to getting in that top 4 in the West is going to be a lot harder than people think, just because the records were so close this year.
Yes.
That gap is really broader than the Pelicans suggested this season.
Boogie Cousins. And I think that David kind of broached it. And I talked about it a little bit on the radio show today. Can you make a major investment in a guy that you don't know is going to come back and be the player that he was? And then, if it's a short-term contract, let's say the Pelicans have all the leverage and they give him a short-term deal, 2 years and a player option, incentive laden. That first year, what can you expect to get out of Boogie Cousins? And if you're going to go into the luxury tax, which they may have to do if they can't divest themselves of contracts, how do you justify to Gail Benson that we're going to luxury going to be a taxpayer now, but Boogie Cousins may only be able to play 20 minutes a game for the whole season?
Well, that's probably the major issue that complicates this whole thing. I don't see them going into the luxury tax if it comes to that, and understandably so in a small market like this. Financially, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so that's the key thing is this would have been a little simpler if he hadn't had the injury.
And they would have been a taxpayer, and he would have been one of the highest paid players. He'd been the highest paid player on the roster, right?
Yeah. And they were just starting to play better with him. Then he goes down. It looks like they're doomed for a week or two. And then after Mirotic settles in, all of a sudden they're a better team without him than they were. So all of a sudden, when you were thinking we got to pay whatever it takes to keep him and maybe consider the luxury tax, all of a sudden you say, well, wait a minute. We might be better, or maybe Mirotic fits what we want to do better than he does. All of a sudden, that money, that luxury tax possibility looks far less inviting than it did before. And so that's why I think it's more likely he does not come back than he does because of that situation. And you're right, you don't know what his health is going to be like. You don't know when he would be able to be a guy who could play 30, 32 minutes a game. He might not have to with Mirotic on board. You could probably adjust his minutes a little bit. But nonetheless, you're going to have to adjust him a lot more than you want to because of the rehab starting out. So, Dell Demps is going to earn his money over the next couple of weeks sorting through this whole
And
thing.
then to throw into that mess, you throw Mirotic back into it because he's going into the final year of his contract.
Right.
And at $12.5 million, he's going to be looking for a raise going into next year. So he's going to want his playing time. He's going to want minutes. He's going to want shots. And to show his value, either to the Pelicans to establish himself there or to another team. So does he become? And then you talk about if the Pelicans are not what they expect to be at the All-Star break, or as you get closer to the trade deadline, and with that shorter period of time. Now are you talking about shopping Mirotic? So there are just dominoes upon dominoes that Dell Demps has to think about going into July 1st, and I don't envy him at all.
Right. We'll talk about what my original question was about. I mean, how do you justify to Gail Benson that we need to be a taxpayer and we need Boogie Cousins, even if he's only 50% of what he was last year, banking that he's going to get better and next year will be the year that we can really make a run, especially after what happened this past year when you finally caught the sports psyche of the fan here. People started paying attention to Pelican basketball.
Yeah, I think that it is hard to justify because if you're not going to be a top 2 or 3 team in the West, to be in the tax and then to be facing the repeater tax the next year, which you most certainly would be facing.
And explain that to the audience if you would.
So if you pay the luxury tax 2 consecutive years, you get what's called the repeater tax, and the amount of money you're over that starts to multiply exponentially for every few $1 million. It's about $5 million intervals beyond that. So the Pelicans are paying $1.50, $1.75, $2 for every dollar that they're over the cap, which really starts to become financially problematic.
That's under the repeater, but just as a
luxury tax, you're paying dollar for dollar.
A dollar for dollar.
Right.
Right. And which you could get into the millions.
Right.
Which is, and again, you're used to getting that check back.
Right.
I mean, they're usually cutting those checks. They're getting those checks from the NBA and the teams that are paying the luxury tax. Now you're moving in a whole different direction. I think it can be justified if you're one of the top 4 teams in the West. I think it's hard to justify if you're taking a flyer on an injured guy and what might happen.
Well, and here's the bottom line is, with him not there, they were one of the top 4 teams in the West. Okay, they were the 6th seed, but they advanced to the conference semifinals. So the Pelicans are sitting there saying, boy, we don't want to just let this guy go. There's intriguing possibilities if he's close to the player he used to be, and maybe it'll be worth the investment. But then you take a step back and you say, there's so much uncertainty here. There's so many financial complications. If we just let him go and get no compensation because we can't do a sign and trade that we want, we still have the core, especially if they bring Rondo back, we still have the core of the team that went to the Western Conference semifinals. I think ultimately that's most likely to be the bottom line, is that there's just too many risks involved in bringing him back when you have such a good nucleus without him.
And then you look at the type of pace you played with in the second half of the season, and will you play that pace with Boogie Cousins? Can he play that pace?
And it's not just the pace. I mean, there was a different tempo.
Yes.
But the Pelicans were a fast team with DeMarcus. Right. But part of that, too, is you cut down on your turnovers. The Pelicans were a much better team at
Rondo had the ball in his hands.
Right. And we saw the only player who really was negatively affected, the players who were negatively affected by DeMarcus's absence statistically, were Darius Miller and Etuan Moore, who got fewer standalone threes than they got when he was on the floor. But everyone else showed an uptick in their performance. Every player across the board. So it's a hard thing, data-wise. Again, all the data and your information, your winning record, all those things show that they were a better team. They only lost 2 games to teams under 500 without DeMarcus. They lost double digits of those when they had him. And there were times when Alvin Gentry, and it's not to put those at the feet of DeMarcus Cousins.
Right, of course not.
But we're just saying that it's about fit. And so, those losses to those teams, those nights where he turned the ball over 8, 9, 10 times a game, those nights where there were a couple of ill-advised threes that against a team like the Warriors lead to extra possessions, those are the things that they have to think about seriously. And then when you talk about the mental part of this, is DeMarcus Cousins the kind of player who you can say, now you're not the first player, you're not the second player, you are now third in our hierarchy? Because Drew Holiday's ascension has made him a borderline, all-NBA player.
Can his ego handle that?
And that's what the question has to be, too. Can he do that? Can you say, we now need you to be more of a screen setter? We need you to not handle the ball so much at the top of the key. And we need you to get back on defense.
Right.
Those are the things you've got to offensive rebound more. If he can do those things, again, those are all suppositions.
Right.
So there's a lot that you don't know that you'd be betting on making that kind of financial commitment.
And one of those factors in Drew Holiday's ascension, not the only factor, but one of the factors is not having Cousins there didn't slow down the offense as much as when he was on the floor. And Holiday took advantage of those opportunities, getting more comfortable playing alongside Rondo, and other things factored into it. But that was one of the factors, is the floor was set up in a better fashion for Drew Holiday to thrive than it was when Cousins was on the floor.
You didn't have 2 bigs clogging up the middle.
Right.
I mean, the spacing was better, and then you had the ball in Rajon Rondo's hand, who again could run the offense. Nothing against Boogie Cousins and what Chris Finch was able to do in Denver, but again, when you look at the number of turnovers Cousins had, when you looked at just him not being on the boards, being out on the 3-point line. I mean, again, I get it. You wanted to open up space for Anthony Davis. This seemed like to be a much more. The players seemed to be much more comfortable with the system in the second half of the season with Rondo in charge than maybe Boogie Cousins handling the ball.
Well, they put Davis closer to the basket.
Absolutely.
I mean,
he flourished.
He took more than 150 fewer jump shots last season than he had the year before. His touches at the rim were much higher. His percentage of shots at the rim were back near 40%, which they hadn't been since his rookie year. So he was getting at the rim, and that's the most important thing for him offensively.
Agreed.
And defensively, I don't think we see him as a finalist for MVP or Defensive Player of the Year if DeMarcus Cousins is still on the team. I mean, just honestly, in January, the talk was DeMarcus Cousins as an MVP candidate, not Anthony Davis. There was no talk of Anthony Davis as a Defensive Player of the Year candidate in January.
Yes.
But you go on that tear in February where he goes 35 and 11 for the month. And then he's starting to get 3, 6, 7 blocks in a game. You're seeing that him playing from the center position and having the ability to move and roam more made him a much more effective defender. So it doesn't just affect the offensive side. It does affect Anthony's ability on both ends of the floor. And I think also, do you see his ascendancy as a top 3, 4, 5 player in the NBA if that never happens? Does he take on that role as leader and owning the team, that ownership of its wins and losses that he did without having DeMarcus?
And one other thing is, you know, you and I have talked about this before, about how we and others had been very critical of Alvin Gentry prior to this season, gave him a lot of praise, and deservedly so this year.
Yes.
But, you know, with the way teams played in Phoenix when he was there, the way Golden State played when he was an assistant there, the way the Pelicans played after they got Mirotic, that's the way Alvin Gentry wants his team to play. It's his comfort zone. It's where he coaches best. It's where he can maximize the tools that he has. When you stick Cousins in there, as good as he is, and the rare skill set that he has for a big guy, it doesn't fit that style as well. And I think if he's just out of the equation and Gentry is just able to play the way that instinctively he wants to get his team to play, I think it just makes more sense.
The other issue is, how much money do you have under the cap if you don't re-sign DeMarcus Cousins?
Right. So I think that their optimum is to do a sign and trade, and to be able to create, at least to get some talent back.
And tell folks why, again, because of the way the NBA salary cap is structured, why if the Pelicans just say, well, we don't want to pay him $23 million a year, or he's on $18 million is what he counted against the cap last year. We should have that $18 million to spend on someone else. But that's not the way it goes, right?
No, because even if they rescind their rights, you can only go over the cap to retain players. You can't do it to go get other people's players. So, even if they said they let go of guys like Okafor and the rest of the bench unit, who's pretty much free agents as well, you still can't use that money and apply it and think that you can, once you hit that hard cap, that's where they are.
Right. Guys, I'll just ask you point blank, should the Pelicans re-sign Boogie Cousins?
Only in a sign and trade. That's right.
Only on a sign, but not in a Pelicans uniform next year.
No.
I would agree with that. I just think we've gone through the options, we've gone through the pros and cons, and I just think when you sift through all of that and you try and find the bottom line, is the uncertainty and the financial considerations aren't worth it, because they've put themselves in a position to still be a very good team without him.
All right. How does Anthony Davis deal with that?
I think he's better than people think. Not that there's a rift between him and DeMarcus Cousins, but I think this was a learning process for Anthony Davis. Seeing Drew Holiday take that step, seeing that the pace of play worked, seeing that he was getting the touches that he really wanted, the easier way. Yeah. I think that if there's a plan, and if Dell Dempson and Alvin Gentry come back and say, this is the talent we brought back, this is the skill set of the players that we have, and here's what we're going to do, I think he'll be fine. But if you just let Cousins walk and there's no plan B, then yeah, any player is going to be concerned about that. But if the plan is in place, if there's a certifiable plan, I think Anthony Davis will be fine.
I agree with that, especially if there's a plan in place, because any player is, all these other considerations. I'm comfortable with him. He's my friend. I like him. Whatever it might be, they want to have a chance to win a ring. Okay, they want to make as much money as they possibly can.
Agreed.
Okay, and he's doing that, and they want to have a chance to win a ring. And they understand, and I think Anthony Davis will understand, and I'm sure they'll explain this to him if they let Cousins go. Yeah, having him would make us a more talented team, but by letting him go and following this plan that we have a better chance to get you a ring by doing it. And if they have a sensible plan and they lay it out to him like that, I think he'll say, sorry, DeMarcus, but I still have a chance to win my ring. This makes more sense for this organization going forward.
How do you sell to the fan base if you don't bring back a Boogie Cousins, who was considered one of the top centers in the NBA? You sold it as his two superstars on the same team. We're building our own super team with our threesome of Holiday, Cousins, and Davis. How do you sell that to the fan base?
Well, I think it all depends on how you get off to a start. Winning covers up everything. And if they get off to a good start next season and they're playing the kind of basketball that they were playing at the end of the season, people forget really quickly. Right. People have short. There's, the DeMarcus Cousins. We got to remember he didn't even play 82 full. No, he hasn't played 82 full games for the Pelicans. So people will have a short memory if you can get production, and if they can find a small forward, which has clearly been their spot of weakness for more than a decade.
Yes.
If they can find a small forward who's capable of defending and capable of moving the basketball, I think Pelicans fans will be fine.
I agree with that, but I would add one more thing. Yeah, you'd like to get off to a good start ideally, but even if you don't get off to a good start, be playing good when the Saints season ends. You can withstand.
It is the truth.
You can withstand the early season if you're struggling. If all of a sudden the Saints stop playing, hopefully in early February, but maybe sometime in January, whenever that happens, if they're hitting their stride then and they make a run like this year and get back to the playoffs, nothing else is going to matter.
But you do hope there's a carryover from last year that again, guys like us who enjoy the NBA and watch the NBA, that, again, the casual NBA fan here in New Orleans starts to pay attention to this team before January.
Right. There has to be some continuity, and that's what Alvin Gentry has stressed, and that's what Dell Demps has stressed. There has to be some type of feeling of this team is progressing forward as a group, that it's not changing and churning. And Dell Demps has faced that every time he's gone had a playoff caliber team. His first one was dismantled by the Chris Paul trade. The second was dismantled by injury. So he doesn't want to have his third playoff team be his last playoff team here in New Orleans.
And how many people get 3 chances?
Right.
As far as a general manager for that. I mean, believe me, that is just an anomaly at best.
Right.
Guys, let's talk Rajon Rondo. Terrific what he did for this team last year, on and off the court, on the bench. I'm interested to see how Frank Jackson plays in the summer league, because he was they were glued at the hip all season long. And again, through osmosis, did he pick up something from Rajon Rondo? $8.8 million mid-level exception. There are some saying that's what he's looking for. One of the questions there is, again, for a guy on the other side of 30, how long do you sign him for? Is it the full mid-level? Is it 2 years? Does everything mirror what Anthony Davis' contract is? How do they approach this?
Well, I think it would be a very limited contract, 1 or 2 years. I think this first year, perhaps only a year, but maybe not, they got everything they wanted out of Rondo and more. They wanted a guy to come in, to lead this group, to bring a level of maturity, to be, if they got to the playoffs, to be playoff Rondo, which he was. I think he was everything they could have hoped for and probably more. Now, I think the team as a whole has matured. I think Drew Holiday learned a lot from that experience. But you can't let him go until you have someone who's going to fill that role as your starting point guard. I think Drew Holiday is better off as your 2-guard, guy who can play some point if he needs to. I don't think Frank Jackson's ready to be a starting point guard in the NBA. So if you let Rondo go, I don't think your starting point guard is on this roster. So you have to have somebody you can bring in to fulfill that role if you let him go. And I don't think that's likely. So I think they have to bring him back at least for 1 more year. But again, I think he's kind of a bridge to a new era with another point guard in a year or 2, depending on what's ultimately out there.
David, is that good enough for Rajon Rondo, 1 year at a time here?
Well, I think he'd like a 2-year deal. I mean, who wouldn't? You're an over 30 point guard in this league, and you've been making shorter money. And we have to remember, too, last year that $3 million plus that he was making was offset by what the Bulls had paid him to go away. Yeah,
they paid him $10 million to go away.
Right, so he could take a cheaper deal. Well, now that money's not available.
Right.
And this may be his last proving, ground for himself to get any deal. So, yeah, if I'm him, I'm asking for that because I know my value to this particular organization. If I'm going to ask, I'm going to ask for all of that mid-level exemption, even if I know I won't get it. If it comes back and it's more like 6.5 rather than 8.8, but I'm going to ask. Because if the Pelicans say that they're willing to go over the cap and willing to go over into the luxury tax for a winner, then if I'm Rajon Rondo, I'm saying, then pay me too.
Right.
Because he knows his value here. Well, like you said, there is no plan B.
But if they go over the cap and they're in the luxury, they're paying luxury tax, then that mid-level exception goes down to $5.3 million. So what do you do there?
Well, I think that's why I think his signing comes first in the way things. Okay. I think he will be signed before DeMarcus is signed, because DeMarcus's number, I think, has probably been communicated between his agent and the team while he's still. They generally know where they are.
Yes.
Now DeMarcus is going to have to go out and find out and see if he can get a better deal, that's his agent's job.
Of course.
But Rondo knows this is where his bread is going to get buttered. So for them, I think the Pelicans want to act quickly and decisively, get him back into the fold, be done with it, and not have any speculation, because there just aren't any point guards on the market for them.
Right. We're going to take a quick break. You're watching Inside New Orleans Sports. I'm your host, Eric Asher. Tonight, Les East and David Grubb of CrescentCitySports.com are our guests. We're going to stay with the Pelicans for a few minutes. When we get back from break, we'll talk about possible free agents. We'll talk about Tony Carr coming to the team, and then we'll jump into some LSU and Saints. We have time, we'll jump into Tulane Green Wave as well. You're watching Inside New Orleans Sports. Hang in there with us.
Villeries Florist, we deliver the magic of flowers 7 days a week to the North Shore and South Shore in the New Orleans area. Whether it's for birthday parties, baby celebrations, Villeries provides colorful floral displays for all. With a store full of fresh-cut flowers, exotic tropical flowers, orchids, roses, and even fruit baskets, our goal is to make your vision a reality. Villeries Florist, proudly serving Louisiana since 1969.
Located at 3701 Iberville Street in Mid-City is Katie's Restaurant and Bar. Open 7 days a week, Katie's offers daily specials for lunch, dinner, and Sunday brunch. Serving New Orleans cuisine such as fried shrimp platters, grilled redfish, and a fully stocked bar. And don't forget about our expanded event seating and local entertainment. Featured on the Best of Food Network's diners, drive-ins, and dives, Katie's Restaurant and Bar.
Yeah, the small forward market is so limited.
Welcome back to Inside New Orleans Sports. I'm your host, Eric Asher. Tonight, Les East and David Grubb of CrescentCitySports.com. We're having a conversation about free agents in the break here. All right, let's take Tony Carr first. Second-round pick, 51st pick in the draft. You don't really expect much out of that, but yet we've seen second-round picks emerge and been pretty darn good players in the league. There's some limitations with this player. Okay, that's why he lasted. Some people are talking about his foot speed. Some are talking, they're talking about other things in his game that maybe are not NBA ready. Is he NBA ready?
No. This is a kid who played 2 years. Shot the ball really well from three-point range. Did not finish great at the rim. Not, like I said, not very quick with his feet. More sturdy and strong. Uses his body to defend.
More of a physical player?
Right. 6'5", has size. And is more of a combo guard rather than a traditional point guard. So, it's going to be tough. And on draft night, Del Dim said this is a long shot. This is a guy that we took a flyer on. We didn't think he would be available at 51. And so, Summer League is really an opportunity for him to see if he gets an opportunity. He's probably more of a candidate for the G League or maybe even a two-way deal, because the Pelicans do have both of those open now. But I don't see him making the opening night roster. It's just there's too many holes in his game for what they need right now.
See, part of the problem is, and again, I understand what Del Demps has tried to do, and packaging number one picks to get rid of bad contracts. In some cases, trying to go after guys with their second deal, letting them, because players are coming into the NBA so young now. Let them get their feet wet in the NBA. Let's see what they're about. We'll pick them up on their second contract. But when you get to the point where you're very, very top heavy on your salary cap, you've got to have these draft choices that will hit for you, because they fill out the bottom half of your roster. And I realize that, again, 51st pick, second round, my gosh, at some point when you start looking down this roster and you start adding up all the numbers, you got to have some players that ultimately are not going to cost you a lot of money. Sometimes you get veterans to do that, but most of them are fringe players that are coming out of the G League or guys that you're drafting.
Yeah, and that's kind of the price they've paid for a lot of these veterans that they've brought in, is that they have not been reluctant at all to give up draft choices and some down the road a ways to get what they felt they needed at that time. And in some cases it worked, some cases it didn't. But that was a price that they chose to pay with mixed results. As for Tony Carr, I don't think he's going to have much of an impact this year. But, the two things I think that give you some hope that he might be in the mix at some point, the fact that he's 6'5" and can play both guard positions. He may be a guy who can give you size at the point even though he's probably more of a 2 naturally, he'll be able to play both, give you some size on the perimeter. And then the other thing is how much his shooting improved from his freshman year to his sophomore year at Penn State. More so on threes than on twos, but nonetheless his three-point shooting percentage went up drastically. So he looks like a guy who maybe has a good learning curve, is willing to put in the work to get better, and he's young enough where I think he may be a guy who has a lot of upside. We'll see, but that to me is encouraging.
On one hand, you say to yourself, my gosh, 6'5", got better from freshman to sophomore. Man, why not stay one more year? But then he got drafted to the second round, and you say, well, you got drafted. I mean, what's the answer there?
I think it's hard to evaluate kids from college to the NBA because the games are so different. And if you're a college kid, you're not really learning the NBA game the longer you stay in. So it's easier to take that risk because if you don't get first round money, at least if you get into the second round, you get into the G League, you're giving yourself an opportunity to prepare yourself for the NBA. Staying in longer in college no longer means that you're a better pro prospect because the games are just getting farther and farther apart stylistically, the caliber of athletes who play the games. So that progression is hard for an athlete to make, to know that just because they've had, look at Buddy Hield, for example.
Sure.
A guy who got better for 4 straight years, came to New Orleans, and just didn't live up and hasn't in his first 2 years, hasn't lived up to that projection of being a capable NBA starter. It's just so hard. So to get guys younger, at least the one thing is you can train them in what you want to do.
Yes. Guys, before we get to possible free agents, let's talk about 2 guys that are on the roster right now, the quote-unquote albatross contracts, Alexis Agenza, Solomon Hill. Is there going to be a market for those players to be traded? Are they going to have to attach number 1 picks to move those? And will those guys get moved before the season starts?
I think Agenza is the easier of the 2 to move because he is an expiring year contract.
$5 million, right?
And it's only $5 million.
Right.
I don't know if it'll be done before the season, but I think if I'm the Pelicans, you may even want to hold him. Because as you get closer to the trade deadline and you see what other injuries, because there will not be great depth on this roster. Right. We know that again.
Sure.
No matter how they come back, this won't be an extremely deep team. So to hold on to him maybe makes some sense. And if you may need him if you're trying to dump a Solomon Hill. You may need that Agenza deal because Solomon Hill does have another year on his deal. And if you don't want to have to give up multiple number 1s down the road, to tag on and at least to have that expiring deal in Agenza, it becomes more attractive. But I think he's the most likely candidate without giving up picks.
I think that's right about Agenza probably being more attractive for those reasons. I think Hill potentially has some attractiveness for a different reason, and that's because he had a really bad injury last year during before they even went to training camp. And when he came back, he did not contribute a whole lot because he wasn't 100%.
Agreed about it.
And I think now that he's farther away from that injury, he had a pretty good role as a defensive player, a guy who could find a niche on the team. If he's able to demonstrate that he's healthier than he was after he came back last year and can still fulfill a valuable role, not as a lead player, but as a guy who can be in your rotation like he was before the injury, maybe there's some attraction there, but there's some question marks there.
When you look at it, even if he comes back and is the defensive player he was at $12 million, almost $13 million a year, is he worth it when you're looking at a guy in Mirotic that's making 12.5, and you know you're going to have to pay him the following year if you want to keep him?
Yeah, it's the thing with Hill is that how many areas can he contribute for you? Because defense is not enough to justify having him on the floor for 25 minutes a night. He doesn't rebound really well for his size. He's too small at the power forward position when they play him against 4s. And last year he wasn't quick enough to keep up with 3s, which they'd used him to kind of muscle 3 small forwards in the league. So if he can't get back into that shape, then it becomes really problematic. But if he at least can become a defensive specialist and hit those corner 3s, that's the big if he can be a 3-and-D guy, he has some value maybe to a team that's competing for a championship. But other than that, it becomes really hard to justify a guy who's scoring 7 points and gives you 2 to 3 rebounds a night.
All right, David, I'm going to hit you first. Limited amount of cap room no matter what happens, whether you re-sign Boogie Cousins, Rajon Rondo, whatever you end up doing. Some free agents that may be in the ballpark for the Pels.
The first guy I look at is a Trey Burke from the Knicks. played point guard for them, came back from the G League, a guy who was a lottery pick the same year that the year that Drew Holiday was traded to New Orleans for Nerlens Noel. A guy who has kind of reclaimed his ability to shoot the basketball, is able to penetrate, got to the line, finished well, assisted the ball well, could be a cheap and serviceable backup who can play both guard positions for you and works well in an up-tempo system. Comes from a guy in John Beilein at Michigan who dealt in a lot of passing situations. So I think he's an intelligent guy who can get you a good minutes at a low price. The thing they really need is a small forward.
Yes, desperately.
And the problem is there are not a lot of guys who in their price range, unless you start taking reaches for a guy like, again, from the Knicks, Michael Beasley, who has put up points. You also talk about can you make a deal for Rodney Hood as a restricted free agent? Is he possible as somebody that you can make a trade for in the market? But it's small forward. It's just a very shallow pool. Maybe a Sadorinsky, who Washington has at the guard position, played both guard positions, is an interesting person. People have talked about Elfrid Payton. I think he's too expensive, and also his skill set doesn't fit in with the Pelicans. Will Barton out of Denver is somebody who you'd love to have.
But can you afford him?
Financial, it's what do you have to give up to get him? Can you get him under your cap? The guys who would fit best are all too expensive for the Pelicans. And so it ultimately comes down to how do you create a package to find one of those guys. But just going out in free agency, what you're going to find are roster fillers.
Right. You know, Rodney Hood has been mentioned a lot over the last couple of days, restricted free agent from Cleveland. If LeBron leaves, well, they're going to try to set up a team around possibly Hood and Love, and then if you go to a restricted free agent, they have the right to be able to match the offer. And then when you have limited salary cap room, I mean, you can't get into a bidding war for Rodney Hood.
No, you can't, and that in general is a problem with free agency overall. Is it's hard to imagine them winning a bidding war. They're going to have to get somebody who doesn't really attract a bidding war. It's like going Christmas shopping on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
They're going to be going there. All the good stuff's going to be gone. Everybody else is going to be set, and they're going to have to look and see what's left that fits their needs because they don't have the money to win a bidding war, and in addition to all the other uncertainty we've talked about. And so, their primary consideration, maybe even more so than position, is financial.
Yes.
Who can we afford that has a chance to maybe outperform the market's expectations? That's really what they have to try and find, and that's a roll of the dice.
Then I got to go back to you, Les, because again, we've been here through all this. That reminds me of Chris Paul and George Shinn. The reason why Chris Paul walked out the door ultimately was because he realized he could not win a championship here because he had an ownership that was cash poor. If you're going to be bargain basement shopping, what message does that send to Anthony Davis?
Well, it does. The one difference, if there is one, is that was more penny pinching. This is more like the money they've already committed. So it's not so much an unwillingness to spend the money to win. It's the fact that they've spent almost all that they can afford to spend.
And in some cases not spent it wisely.
And not spent it wisely. Whereas before, George had a ceiling.
Right.
I mean, we wouldn't be talking about the potential for going into the luxury tax if George Shinn was still the owner.
When you look at what happened again after with Chandler West and CP3, once they moved Chandler, the handwriting was on the wall, right, David?
Right. And then when David West, when they pretty much said that, hey, we're not going to give him what he's asking for. Paul had pretty much figured out, and on the way out, he said, I would never go back to that organization because of the leadership there.
Different organization now for the most part, even though, again, Dell Demps is still here, but different ownership who has deep pockets. It's just whether you're willing to, again, lose money and go into the luxury tax and pay and not be one of the top teams in the West.
Because you're talking about a lot of bets, and you're taking, this is a parlay across a bunch of different areas because you're trying to make a bet on Anthony Davis's future. You're trying to make a bet on the near future in the playoffs, and you're looking across the scape of the Western Conference, and you say Golden State's not falling off tomorrow, Houston's not falling off tomorrow,
and who's the next
then you
super
talk about
team?
a healthy Utah. A healthy Utah, without being a super team, a healthy Utah is as good as anybody in the NBA. And then you talk about, potentially LeBron moving to the Lakers. You talk about the Clippers maybe reloading quickly. You talk about Dallas. The Western Conference is not going to get easier. And Portland still. I mean, a team, Denver. All those teams are going to get better. So the Western Conference, it's not, even the Pelicans at 48 wins, that ceiling is not going to be high enough next year. They've got to get into the mid-50s to take that next step. And is it, even with DeMarcus, you asked that question, are they capable with that group of really getting into the top 2 or 3? And if they're not, it doesn't make sense to go into the luxury cap knowing that you're still bumping your head up against the elite of the NBA.
Yeah.
But there's a wild card in all of this is when it comes to going into the luxury tax or overspending or spending a lot of money, whatever it might be. We don't know how Gail Benson is going to respond.
We don't.
She's never been in this position before. Agreed. They may go to her and she may say, here's the checkbook. I want to win a championship, whatever it takes. I trust you. And now, maybe that's a good approach. Maybe it's not a good approach. We don't know how she's going to react. She may be willing to open the pocketbook a lot. She may not. But we don't know.
I mean, we know the one thing we do know is that she'll lean heavily on the guys from the Saints side who have been there, so long, and Mickey Loomis and Lasha and what they advise. And I would just be, I would think, I think she wants to win a championship because that was the commitment that Tom made before he passed away. But I would also think that they do want to be fiscally responsible, knowing that $40 million potential for Anthony Davis, as it rises over the latter half of his career, that's coming down the road.
You see, guys, I think the reason you're in the position now is that they tried to take the shortcut because of Tom Benson's age. They wanted to try to win a championship as quickly as they could. That's why they didn't go to the draft choices. That's why they brought in players with their second contracts. And that's why, again, when they thought this NBA salary cap was going to continue to expand a few years ago and before it went flat, they figured, there's plenty of money so you can overpay players. Now it's kind of come back to bite them a little bit. They don't have quality depth that you're not paying a lot of money for, and they're very, very top-heavy on their salary cap, and they got to figure it out. And this is, we all, I think, agree, this is a critical offseason for this franchise.
One thing I'll say real quick is that there are 3 possibilities with the major issue. Either Cousins comes back, he leaves, they get nothing, or they do a sign and trade and get something. One of those 3 is going to play out. Whichever one it is, there's still there's more reason to be optimistic at this point and going into next season than there has been in quite some time.
Yes.
And that's the positive I would take from it.
Speaking of optimism, what a great segue. A little bit of optimism up in Baton Rouge right now, right? I mean, it went from, again, what happened at the bowl game to losing Patrick Surtain to now, after what happened after the LSU camp last week, with, again, all these big-time players verbally committing to the program. People are excited about LSU. Again, they're throwing accolades at Ed Orgeron. I would caution the fan base out there that it's very difficult to tell a coach no when you've been in a camp, you've been there, you're all enthralled in the rah-rah LSU, and at the end of the day, that coach is saying, well, are you ready to commit to us? And of course, you're a 14, 15, 16-year-old, 17-year-old kid. Of course you're going to commit. You're going to say, yes, I want to be a Tiger. But again, the rubber hits the road in December when it comes to the signing day, a national signing day, the first one. Talk a little bit about what's going on. You had a chance to be at the LSU Caravan this evening. Both you guys watched this very closely. Your thoughts on what's transpired over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, verbal commitments aren't worth the paper they're written on. Okay, so they're not written on paper. So we have no idea who's actually going to be there, who follows through on their commitment and who doesn't. And we know that they're not going to all wind up at LSU, or the chances of that are very limited, though they may poach somebody from somewhere else to make up for it. You never know. But we don't know who's going to wind up signing. And whatever changes occur between now and December or February is most likely going to be affected by how LSU does this season and what these recruits think about LSU when they're in the midst of the SEC season and they're having a great year or they're having a not so great year. So what's happened with verbal commitments here over the last couple of weeks, I think, means very, very little. At the Caravan, Ed Orgeron was there, Steve Ensminger was there, Dave Aranda was there. So it was an all-star crew. The dream team was there for the Caravan. And there was a lot of optimism, but I didn't sense that there was, at least when the coaches talked to us, there were some questions about the commitments, but there were a lot of questions about who's going to play quarterback. You don't have anything proven at running back. Your wide receivers, a lot of talent, nothing's proven there. Defense should be good, but can it carry an offense that's going to have to grow? and the schedule with Miami and Georgia coming on. So there are a lot of question marks about this season, and how this team performs is going to go a long way to determining which of those commitments lead to actual signings.
And then the other things that have happened in the NCAA and will happen in the NCAA over the course of the coming year, the new transfer rules being eased and things like that, that will affect player movement and the opportunities for kids where they go. And of course, coaches getting hired and or fired, always impacts commitments. So we'll see how that shakes out. Again, like Les said, it's way too early to get super excited. I mean, this is LSU. You're going to recruit well from year to year. It's how do you develop those players and how do they perform on Saturdays. And what we know is, last year LSU underperformed slightly, didn't live up to expectations, and this year their schedule is probably more difficult than it was last year. It's, if not the most difficult schedule in the SEC. It is the most, one of the most. So they have bigger issues than these commitments. Right. That's for fans to think about down the road. But right now there are some real things to think about as they approach that game in Jerry World against Miami. We'll
get back to LSU in a moment. Let's head to the phone lines, 866-3200. Toby is in Gretna. Toby, welcome to Inside New Orleans Sports. Hey, Toby.
Hey, Eric. Would Tristan Thompson be a good fit here? And also, what happened to Duncan Holder? And thank you.
Got it. I think Tristan Thompson would be a great fit here if Boogie Cousins is not here, because I've always said Anthony Davis doesn't want to play the 5. Right. So ultimately, if you've got a guy that can rebound, that can play defense for you, and doesn't need the basketball to be effective at the center position, that works for the Pelicans.
Right. The things that you notice that the Pelicans do really well when Anthony Davis is on the floor without DeMarcus is that when they have a big who can screen, one of the things, especially for Drew Holiday, he loves to come off of screens and drive downhill towards the basket. So that's not when DeMarcus is playing out high, you don't get as many of those. But that's one of the things he liked about Ashik. That's one of the things that Drew likes about Diallo is that they're both hard screeners. So a guy like Tristan Thompson who can do a hard screen, roll back to the basket for lobs, again, doesn't need the ball in his hands, great on the offensive glass, very strong. And you have to take back that deal. Again, it's about the numbers too. And he has a bigger deal that would fit into that slot.
Yeah, I agree with that. If they can get him here, assuming Cousins leaves, they can get him here because of the way he would fit with Anthony Davis and Drew Holiday. I think he is potentially a good fit. I don't know if the chances of that happening are all that great, but he's potentially a good fit, yes.
Yeah. Darvell is in New Orleans. Darvell, welcome to Inside New Orleans Sports. Hey, Darvell.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. Your question?
My question is, Solomon Hill has a horrible contract. I will keep Alex Jensen because, he can help out that center position. But at the same point, if we can get something for Solomon Hill and go after whatever you have with Solomon Hill, go after either Rodney Hood or Rudy Gay. Because I heard that, we was trying to sign Rudy Gay as well.
Okay. Dave?
I think Rudy Gay's out of price range. He made nearly $10 million with San Antonio last year. And I believe he's opting in with San Antonio, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't see a path for Rudy Gay to come. And again, I don't know if it's the right fit for him. And I don't know if the Pelicans are I don't think vice versa. I don't think the skill sets match for me. And Rudy Gay is also a guy who's a year removed from an Achilles injury.
Right.
So are you want to take a value risk on a guy over 30 coming off an Achilles injury? You need youth, you need depth. I don't know if Gay's the guy to do that.
Yeah.
No, I don't think Rudy Gay makes a lot of sense for the Pelicans at this point. Yeah. If you could get Rudy Gay a few years ago and you could afford him, that would be quite a pickup. But at this point, I don't think it makes a lot of sense.
Derek Stingley Jr., talk about him.
I mean, it's hard to talk about him. He hasn't played a lot. It's just he's so much of an unknown quantity at this stage. So it's a lot of projection there. And I think that's people are always interested in what the enigma of it, but it's hard to get really excited about him either way.
I agree.
I mean, come on, number one player in the nation. I mean, all you've been hearing. I mean, again, he's the cherry on top of the recruiting class this year. I mean, he's the guy that's supposed to go out and be able to bring other top-notch players to LSU. You guys are kind of lukewarm on him.
Sure, there's reason to be excited about it, but I'm using another Christmas metaphor. I'm a real Grinch when it comes to recruiting. We had a walk-on who transferred, just won the Heisman Trophy, and was the #1 pick in the NFL draft. I mean, that's
true.
I don't know. Let's see what happens. Yeah, it's good to have someone with those kind of credentials coming in your recruiting class, but
you had that 2 years ago. You thought the recruiting class with Blakeney and Simmons was going to be the one that resurrected LSU basketball, and none of those guys stayed around long enough to do that. So, and none of them lived up to what they thought the potential of that group was. So, yeah, recruiting is just such a long shot. And even when you bring guys in, the guys that LSU has had who've produced as recruits for basketball, a lot of them over the last few years, again, it has not translated into team success.
Joe Burrow, talk about him. What do you think is going to happen there? I mean, again, another unknown going into this season. I mean, again, there's not a big book on Joe Burrow, what he did at Ohio State, which is really nothing. And, now he seems to be the savior coming into Baton Rouge.
Yeah, both Ed Orgeron and Steve Ensminger said tonight that they like his size and he's very smart. They like that. Those are two good things. You can't really teach either one of those. And they brought him here because they weren't convinced any of the other three was going to be what they hoped they would be. Doesn't mean they can't be, but they still had some doubts about the three guys on campus. So I think Joe Burrow, probably if you were going to go to Vegas and put odds on who's going to be the starting quarterback against Miami,
you can go to Mississippi now.
Sure. we'll go. Yeah, but they're just learning how to set odds over there. I don't know if they're on top of things, but he would probably be a slight favorite over Miles Brennan. I think those are probably the two guys who are going head to head here. I don't know. I mean, I think he had some bad luck at Ohio State with a thumb injury and with the talent he was competing with. So, I cut him a little slack for not having done a lot more at Ohio State. A lot of credentials from high school. So we'll see. I think there's a good chance you'll see him start this year at some point, perhaps even the opener. But I wouldn't count on him being the savior. If there's a savior to this program, it's going to be the defensive line.
Yeah, I would agree. Final word on Joe Burrow.
Yeah, I think, obviously that you don't bring him in unless you feel like he's going to be, if not your starter, then right there when the season begins. I think we'll find out the first 3 or 4 games, and then by the time they get out of that early part, by the time they get to the Auburn game, the starter should be settled. I don't think it'll be settled necessarily. I think there will be split reps against Miami, and I think certainly against Southeastern Louisiana. But by the time you get to Auburn, they want to have their starter settled. So I think both of the quarterbacks will get their reps.
And as we talked before the show, probably a package for Narcisse if he stays, right?
There should be, some plays for him. But if things are going well, they shouldn't have to use them.
Right.
And that's what LSU's hoping.
This is the kind of stuff you get at CrestLeeSports.com all the time. Got to make it one of your favorites. It's a go-to spot if you want to know what's happening in local sports. Les Cease, David Grubb, thanks for being on the panel tonight.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Remember, there's a rebroadcast of this program each and every Friday night right here on WLAE-TV at 10 p.m. We're also on Pelican Sports Television every Friday night at 9 p.m. You can catch me on the radio noon to 2 on Sports 1280, 101.1 FM HD2, and the iHeartRadio app. It's a free download for your smartphone or tablet. You can listen live, download the podcast at ericasher.com. All the previous episodes of Inside New Orleans Sports can be seen at ericasher.com as well. Again, special thanks to David Grubb and to Les Cease. Also the WLA production staff, including Ron Yeager, Jim Dotson, Trey Lopez, Alex Chacon. Subbing in for the producer, for director extraordinaire William Hill. Tonight is Naila Jones, who did a fabulous job as always. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week for another edition of Inside New Orleans Sports.